A nome del Comitato di Festival Letteratura ringraziamo Gruppo TEA per aver contribuito alla realizzazione di questo evento. A mettere gli accenti al posto giusto, Luca Pareschi.
Thank you. Welcome back to Accenti. This event will be held in English. So, in the last years, Professor Oreskes worked on the parallel between climate change and other public controversies. Thanks to this work, in the next 30 minutes, together with Sofia Pasotto, she will tell us several things about climate change denial. So, ALTRA MAREA, this accento, is starting now.
Hello everyone, ciao a tutti e a tutte. Questo evento sarà in inglese. And we have here Professor Oreskes, who is a renowned professor from Harvard. And I am so excited to have you here. So thank you so much for your time and availability. And let's start with a bit of spice. So 2023 for me personally, was the year of climate denial. You know, in Italy, we had climate denial in the news, in papers, at the governmental level. So in the news, like the climate crisis was portrayed willingly as just bad weather. You know, we had extreme events who were, yeah, that's just bad weather, you know. And then in talk shows, for example, climate denialists were given the same space as well-known scientists. And I know that you talk about it in your book, Merchants of Doubt. And at the governmental level, we have city councillors and authorities and ministers who say, it is just bad weather. It is just good weather. We have people that are at the top of the hierarchy saying, you know, it's just like a bit warmer than usual. It's because of solar cycles, it's because of Milankovitch cycles, it's because of El Niño, you know, and stuff like that. So for me, 2023 was quite hard, the year of climate denial. And I was wondering, was it the same for you? Or do you have a specific year that you said, wow, this one is bad?
Well, that's a very difficult question because I've been tracking this issue for a long time now, and what we've seen is cycles of stronger and weaker denial. But I think one thing that's certainly the case, all of the things you've said, we've tracked here in the United States for more than 20 years. We've seen this pattern of people in positions of power and influence downplaying climate change, claiming that these extreme weather events are just weather, claiming it's El Niño, claiming it's Milankovitch cycles. All those things are very familiar to me. What's particularly upsetting, though, about this past year is that it reinforces a pattern that we've seen before. Scientists have often believed that if only the evidence was clear, then people would understand the problem and they would begin to act. And so scientists have worked for more than 30 years now, particularly scientists in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but elsewhere as well, to explain the science as clearly as possible, to accumulate as much scientific evidence as possible, and in more recent years to prove that these extreme weather events are in fact caused or made much worse by global climate change. And particularly this year, we've had multiple events, flooding, even as we speak, flooding in Hong Kong, flooding in China, extreme heat in the United States, fires in Hawaii. All across the globe, we have seen extreme weather events that are shattering previous records. Scientists have generally had a kind of hopefulness, a kind of confidence that as the evidence became clearer and clearer, it would become impossible to deny. But that is not what has happened. And it's not what has happened because none of this is evidence-based. All of this is politically based. And so we have right-wing parties across the globe, in Italy, in Canada, in the United States, in England, who resist accepting the reality of climate change because of its implications for global capitalism, for its implications for the highly consumptive lifestyle that particularly Americans live, but that Europeans, to a lesser but not negligible extent, live too. And so this is what Eric Conway and I have called implicatory denial. Politicians and people deny the evidence that is in front of their faces because they don't like the political and social implications. They don't want to accept the reality that it is our consumptive lifestyle that is driving this dangerous change that is hurting people, killing people, destroying communities, burning down homes. So instead of acknowledging it and thinking about the way we might change our economic and social systems, they say, oh, it's just weather.
And at the beginning of, in the 60s, 70s, I know that environmental issues were kind of conservative issues, What changed? Like, is it all fault of capitalism? I would say personally, yes. But I would love to hear your take on that.
Sure. Well, and of course, this is a very difficult issue because, it's easy to blame it on capitalism, and many people will say that's oversimplified. And I think it is oversimplified because capitalism has changed over the course of time. The extremely pro-market, anti-regulatory policies that we've seen implemented in the United States and Europe in the last 40 years are not the same as the policies that were implicated or that were used, say, in the mid 20th century. So capitalism can take different forms. My new book with Eric Conway, The Big Myth, is all about the particular form of extremely unregulated or poorly regulated capitalism that has dominated in the last 40 years. And our argument is that we need to kind of get capitalism under control. We need to figure out ways to better regulate markets to account for what economists call the external costs, sometimes referred to as the social cost of carbon, and that this can be done. It's been done in the past, and it could be done again. But getting back to the start of your question about conservatism, so yes, this is a very interesting political reversal. Historians are always really interested in places where things change, and especially reversals are so interesting to us because they prove to us that things have been different in the past, and they could be different again in the future. They don't have to be the way they are right now. One of the ways that people in power hold on to power is by trying to persuade us that there's no other alternative, that this is the only way things could be. We saw that very strongly in the United Kingdom during the years when Margaret Thatcher was prime minister, in which she famously articulated the Tina doctrine. I don't know if this translates into Italian, but it stood for there is no alternative. And her claim was that there was no alternative to running the economy, but the sort of deregulated anti-labor, anti-union policies that she was implicating. Now, we know that that's not true. There are always alternatives. And one reason that I cherish my role as a historian is that one of the things history does for us is show us what those alternatives could be, what they've been in the past and what they could be in the future. So if we look at the history of the conservation movement in the United States, it was, as you just said, conservative. I mean, it's not a coincidence that the word conservative and conservation start with the same beginning because it's about conserving things. So in the United States, the conservation movement was mostly promoted in the early 20th century by what were called at the time progressive Republicans, but they were conservatives, people like the American Republican president Teddy Roosevelt, the industrialist John D. Rockefeller, and other prominent, generally wealthy white men who thought that conserving and preserving places of unique natural beauty was an important part of the national heritage of this country. And similar conservation movements developed elsewhere. What changed in the 1960s and 70s was the growing recognition of the damage done by industrial pollution. So instead of just being concerned about preserving places of unique natural beauty, like in the United States, a place like Yellowstone National Park or the Grand Teton National Park, or in Switzerland, parts of the Alps, instead of focusing on the preservation of natural beauty, people became concerned about preventing industrial pollution that was doing damage to human and environmental health. The most famous American voice in that regard was Rachel Carson in her famous important book, Silent Spring, which spoke about the damage done both to people and to wildlife from persistent pesticides like DDT. When the environmental movement began to shift to a greater focus on industrial pollution, it also then developed a shift on government regulation of industry. And that led to a backlash. It led to industrial resistance to these new regulations because they limited what businesses could do. Some progressive businesses accepted it. some progressive businesses said, okay, well, we can do other things. We can improve the way we operate. And the best positive example of that is the DuPont Corporation, which in the 1980s and 90s stopped manufacturing chlorinated fluorocarbons, the chemicals that destroy stratospheric ozone, and developed a set of alternatives. So it wasn't the case that business necessarily had to go down the path of denial and disinformation, but we know that many companies did, and particularly the fossil fuel industry. So when scientists began to point out that burning fossil fuels put greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, that changed the chemistry of the atmosphere, that caused the Earth to warm up, and that this was likely to do very, very serious damage, what we see is that as the scientific evidence begins to come together, denial begins to come together as well. And so in the late 1980s into the early 1990s, we see the fossil fuel industry and other industrial allies and allies in libertarian right-wing think tanks organizing to fight the scientific information. And in the United States, that began in the late 1980s, and it continues to the present day.
And you spoke a bit about alternatives, and the CFCs, and so for the people here that are just listening, we had a very, very important protocol, which was the Protocol of Montreal for the ozone layer, for the protection of the ozone layer, and it worked. It worked. Surprisingly, it worked. And we had we didn't even have all the evidence, and you say it very well in the book. We did not have, in Merchants of Doubt, we did not have all the evidence to say, okay, the ozone layer is, is reducing, and we have to deal with it. We have to fix it. But they had it in mind, like scientists were thinking about it and were studying on it. So, since you mentioned alternatives and fossil fuel companies, my question would be, the Protocol of Montreal worked because there were alternatives to CFCs, so these substances that cause the ozone layer depletion. And now we have cheaper alternatives to producing energy instead of fossil fuels. We have solar, we have wind, we are working on hydrogen, we have nuclear power, and all of these, renewable energies. So what changed, or better, what worked in the CFC, let's say, convention or realm that now is not working?
Well, the CFC story, the ozone story, is a really important one for people to know about because it is a success story. I get questions all the time from journalists these days who say, oh, I don't want another gloom and doom story. Give me some good news. And that's hard to do because, frankly, the news on climate change right now is not good by and large. However, we do have past success stories. And the stratospheric ozone story is one of those successes because, as you say, the Montreal Protocol was an international treaty to ban the substances that were destroying stratospheric ozone, to say we can live without these substances. And frankly, we can't live with them because if we don't do something about it, the loss of stratospheric ozone was going to threaten life on Earth, because without the ozone layer, we would be bombarded by ultraviolet radiation from the sun, which would ultimately kill us. I mean, that's something that I think a lot of people don't appreciate about this story, is it really was a matter of life and death. So world leaders came together with the cooperation of the business community and passed the Montreal Protocol. It's a success story. The ozone layer is recovering, and people are not, life on Earth can continue because we took that action. So what changed? Well, one of the interesting things about the IPCC and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is that it was modeled on the Kyoto Protocol. And I've heard a lot of people criticize the IPCC, criticize the UN Framework Convention, but that's, I think, an unfair criticism because they had a model that had worked. And so it wasn't foolish or illogical to say, well, that model works, so let's apply it to climate change. The problem, I think, was twofold. Climate change was a much worse problem because the entire economy of the world didn't depend on CFCs. They were useful chemicals. They could be used in refrigeration, air conditioning. These are important things, but it turned out there were other chemicals that could do the same job. And crucially, the DuPont Corporation, which was the world's largest producer of CFCs at that time, listened to its own scientists who said, yeah, these chemicals are really bad, but we can come up with alternatives. So the private sector did the right thing. But that's not what's happened for climate change. In climate change, we've seen the opposite. The private sector has really dug in. Big companies like ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell have refused to commit to phasing out the use of fossil fuels. They have fought tooth and nail against climate policies, both in Europe, the United States, and around the globe. They continue to explore for new oil and gas reserves. They are continuing to be committed to developing oil and gas reserves around the globe. And they continue, most of them, as far as we can tell, are continuing to fund disinformation. And they get away with this, I think, in part because they're incredibly powerful, but also because it is true that, unlike CFCs, the whole global economy is built on fossil fuels. Everything we do, all of our economic activity, even me sitting here today talking to you over my computer, is fueled by electricity that is largely fueled by fossil fuels. So the scale of the economic transformation that's required is much greater, and the power of the companies involved is greater. I mean, DuPont is a powerful corporation, but not as powerful as ExxonMobil. And where DuPont did the right thing, the fossil fuel industry has done the wrong thing. And so this has made it very difficult to affect the policies that would support the change. And that's the key point here that I think, again, many people don't recognize. It's not enough to have the technologies. You have to have the policies in place that support those technologies. So when the Kyoto Protocol required countries to stop using chlorinated fluorocarbons, that policy became a strong incentive for DuPont to create other chemicals that could be used instead. But by and large, in most countries in the world, the policies we have in place are still continuing to support fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are still subsidized to the tune of over $1 trillion every single year in this country. And that vastly dwarfs any subsidies that any country is giving to renewable energy.
Absolutely. And, also the Italian government subsidizes one of the biggest polluters of the world, which is ENI, which is also the sponsor of this festival. And the thing is that it is very, yeah, you laugh, but the very interesting thing is that these fossil fuel companies go everywhere, to cultural events, to musicals, to art demonstrations, and they literally control the foreign policy also of states. Because, if fossil fuel companies decide that a state needs, I don't know, more gas, more oil, more coal, they'll go to, for example, COPs, Conference of Parties, which is where climate change related issues are discussed at a more international level. And how do you think we can get over this? How do you think we can take ourselves out of this mad mechanism of fossil fuel companies influencing state policies?
Well, it's very difficult. I think your comment points to the fact that this is a very deep, very profound, and very broad political problem. And so one thing we need to do is to stop talking about climate change as a scientific question. When we talk about climate change as a scientific question, when we talk about parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere and radiative transfer, what people hear is this is a scientific problem that scientists have to solve. But it's not a scientific problem anymore. The science is clear. We know what's going on. It's a political problem because of the power of the fossil fuel industry and its deep interconnection with governments around the world. And the way in which fossil fuel industry, as you said, the last COP meeting, there were more representatives of fossil fuel companies than there were delegates from people, from delegates from countries. We know that the fossil fuel industry is closely linked to governments all across the globe. And so people have to think about political work, political opposition to change this. And that can mean how you vote in your own country. It means joining organizations that are fighting for meaningful climate policies. It means working with your own institutions to resist the influence of the fossil fuel industry. So here at Harvard, I was at a meeting just the other day where someone said, yeah, but they're offering money for professorships and graduate fellowships, and isn't that a good thing? And the answer is no, it's not a good thing, because it corrupts the university. It influences how we think about these problems, and it buys social license. So when the fossil fuel industry funds festivals, funds music festivals, funds university fellowships, it creates the sense that these are good companies, that they are good partners, that we should be working with them. And that's what they want. They want us to believe that they can be trusted partners in solving this problem. But their own actions over the last 30 years prove beyond any reasonable doubt that they cannot be trusted partners, that they lie about what's going on, they promote disinformation, and they claim to be interested in solving the climate change problem, where all their actions are actually making it worse.
You got a round of applause. And on this note, also fossil fuel companies pay journalists or, scientists, you said, and also in this book, she and Eric Conaway talk about it in an excellent way. It's a deep dive on just how it works, fossil fuel companies and tobacco companies also, because this is a book about denialism in general. So it's not only climate change, but they pay also, for example, journalists. So in your book, you mentioned the fairness doctrine, right? Yeah, and so the fairness doctrine is basically saying, in a very simple way, giving the same weight and the same space to people who are not the same, meaning to people that deny climate change and to people that are scientists, like well-known scientists, So how do we get past that? Like, there shouldn't be a debate on science. You also say it in your book. There shouldn't be a debate on science. Science is not very democratic, so it is this or that. And these people that go on television, go in debates, and are given equal space are, let's say, nurturing a doubt, a kind of doubt that it's not reasonable. You call it a reasonable doubt. So how do we stop this? How do we get past this fairness doctrine?
Well, I don't think the problem is the fairness doctrine per se. So in the United States, the fairness doctrine was actually a statute that was developed in conjunction with the granting of licenses, radio licenses, and then subsequently television licenses. So because these licenses were a finite resource, there's only a certain amount of bandwidth available on the radio. Having a radio license was considered a public service, a public obligation, a public good. And so the fairness doctrine said that if you had a radio license and if you presented information on an issue of public concern that presented a certain point of view, then you had an obligation to allow others to present alternative. Responsible spokesman was the phrase that was often used, presenting alternative views. And that was a good thing. That fostered democratic debate. It fostered diversity of opinions and views, particularly on political and social issues. The problem is that two things, or maybe three things, happened. First of all, the fairness doctrine was repealed in the Reagan administration, and this opened the floodgates for right-wing media, particularly on the radio, to promote extreme right-wing views without any counterbalancing by other opinions. And so in the United States today, we know that the airwaves are flooded with anti-scientific information, and there's no obligation for those radio stations to allow scientists to come and counter the anti-scientific propaganda that's being presented. But the other problem is the confusion, I think, that has happened among many journalists, but also among just public commentators in general, between the notions of fairness, the notions of objectivity, and the notions of balance. So fairness doesn't mean that you give time to Nazis to promote anti-Semitic viewpoints on the radio. It doesn't mean that you allow cranks to say that, COVID-19 was created by monkeys or something like that. I mean, fairness doesn't mean that you put nonsense on radio or television, but somehow the right wing has tried to use it to say that somehow it does mean that. And so what we saw during the climate years, and in our book, we show that this came straight out of the tobacco story. So when, again, our work is mostly based in the United States, but many of the same patterns have also taken place in Europe. When the scientific evidence began to be clear that tobacco smoking was deadly, and reporters began to report on the scientific findings, the tobacco industry pushed back and demanded, quote, equal time for the industry viewpoint. The industry viewpoint was not supported by science. It was not supported by facts, but they managed to pressure journalists into giving them equal time for their view, exploiting the notion of objectivity, pressuring journalists by saying, if you don't let us give our point of view, you're not being objective. So it's conflating objectivity, fairness, balance, and truth. And so my argument has always been that the obligation of journalists, like the obligation of academics, is to present the truth as best as we can figure out what that is. And it doesn't mean we have to give equal time to nonsense, to lies, to disinformation, but sorting out the difference between information and disinformation is not always easy. And that's why it's important to do homework. It's why it's important to be aware of the fact that there are these propaganda campaigns out there. And it also means that if you're talking about a scientific subject, I mean, there is debate in science. Of course there is. I'm not saying there's never debate or doubt in science, but that debate is a debate among scientists. It's not a debate between scientists and politicians. And so if we want to have a political debate about policy options for climate change, that's of course completely legitimate. But what we shouldn't be doing, and I think journalists in the States don't do this as much as they used to, but I've certainly seen places in the world where it is still happening. If scientists are presenting hard-won scientific data, you should not be, quote, balancing that with political propaganda. And yet that is often what we have seen in this space.
But don't you think that scientists are a bit unapproachable in their communication? You know, we have we have to make climate change a social issue, a political issue, not only like a scientific issue. But it's so hard for normal people to just approach the issue because it's either too hard, it's either oversimplified. So how do we fix that?
Well, it is true. I mean, scientists have not always helped. I mean, scientists often speak in very complicated language. I think there are some scientists who, in a way, enjoy the mystification because it makes them feel important that they know things that other people don't know. And I think that's very unfortunate. But by and large, I do think in recent years, scientists have they've tried to explain this issue more clearly. But again, as I've said, it's not primarily a scientific problem. The science is really not that complicated. I mean, it's pretty simple to explain that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. And what does that mean? It means it lets light through the atmosphere, but it traps heat. And so the more carbon dioxide you have in the atmosphere, the more the planet will heat up. That's not that complicated. Where does that CO2 come from? Well, there is some natural carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Volcanoes do put additional CO2 into the atmosphere, but the vast majority of the increase in CO2 that we've seen in the last 100 years comes from burning fossil fuels. And we know that, A, because we know how much fossil fuels we've burnt. I mean, Rick Heady's work on this is very compelling and important. And B, because we can measure the isotopic composition of the CO2 and prove that it comes from burning fossil fuels and not other sources. So these are unequivocal scientific facts. They can be explained, as I just did, without any equations, without fancy language. And it's really important that scientists do that. And I agree with you, scientists are not always that great at explaining things plainly and clearly.
Maybe we should, forgive me for the citation, but maybe we should make science pop again, more understandable. And last question, what do you see in the future? Like, how do you see the future? Because, you know, it's hard for us climate activists, but also for people that experienced just extreme weather events. It's hard not to be discouraged and just to see the future as kind of gray. I wouldn't say black as coal and as oil, but gray. How do you see it? Do you see maybe COP28 as a highlight, a potential success? We are very skeptical about that, so I would love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, honestly, I wouldn't put a lot of faith in COP28. I mean, we've seen tremendous amount of, I mean, the very fact that it's being chaired by a person linked to the oil and gas industry is very disheartening. So I wouldn't put a lot of confidence or faith in COP28. And even if it weren't being run by the fossil fuel industry, I mean, just the number 28 tells you, I think, everything you need to know. This is the 28th meeting of the Council of Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is a structure that has frankly not proved highly effective in getting meaningful climate policy. So I think that's telling us that we really have to look elsewhere. It's sad. I feel sad to say that I have many, many friends involved in the COP process, but I think we have to be honest and say that the process has not achieved its goals. So I think we're at a crossroads. I think this is a critical moment. I think it's great that you all are here talking about it because we're at a critical juncture for two reasons. The bad reason is what we started talking about. Climate change is here, it's accelerating. It's all the adverse effects that scientists predicted are all now coming true. Antarctic ice is melting, Greenland ice is melting, hurricanes have got worse, floods and heat waves have got worse, people are being killed. That's the bad news. The good news is what we've also mentioned, that the technology to fix this problem largely exists. Solar and wind are now cheaper than fossil fuels in almost all global markets, but the obstacles to large-scale implementation are largely political. And that means that it is in our power as citizens, as individuals, this looks like a pretty young audience, so as young people, to become engaged politically, to demand change, to take to the streets, to take to the voting booths, to join organizations. If you look at the big social movements of the past that have made real change in the world, many of them have been bottom up. They've involved ordinary people saying enough is enough. And I think we're at that moment. So we are at a crossroads. We have choices to make. And this is a really crucial time for everyone to become involved in the climate issue because all of our futures are at stake.
So let's say that 2023 started as the year of climate denial, but hopefully 2024 will be the year of climate action. Thank you so much, Professor Oreskes.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
And thank you to Sofia as well.
Benissimo.
So we are sure
Thank you.
that these 30 minutes solve several doubts in our understanding. Please remember that you can find the book by Professor Oreskes in the corner, in the stand. Noi ci vediamo invece alle 8:30 per ritornare a rimettere gli accenti qui in Casa Accenti. Parleremo di rivalità nel mondo della ginnastica artistica con Tiziana Scalabrini. A più tardi.